What if, from one day to the next, your life was destroyed? You sleep innocent and wake up condemned. No proof, no chance of defense, no turning back. Now try to imagine being ripped from your home, thrown behind bars and treated like a criminal without having committed any crime. You enter prison young and leave after decades. But does it really come out? And when everything you knew no longer exists? Your family? Gone? Your friends? They forgot you? Your time? Stolen. This happened to Stephen Barnes. For 25 years, he was forced to bear the burden of a crime he didn't commit, while the real culprit remained free. But the question that really matters is, how many other innocent people are living this same nightmare right now? The system makes mistakes, the system destroys, and when he realizes he made a mistake, he simply turns away. But is an apology enough? What do you do when justice fails and buries you alive in a cell? If you've made it this far, this story has had an impact on you. And how many more need to be told before something changes? Every day, innocent people are convicted without proof, while the true culprits remain free. The truth cannot be ignored. Leave your like to spread this reality and subscribe to discover the cases that many would prefer to hide. Stephen Barnes never imagined his life would change overnight. He was not a criminal. He had no police record. He had never been in trouble. Just another young man like so many others, trying to build a future with a simple routine, surrounded by friends, family, and dreams. But in a small town, when fear takes over, it's not the truth that matters. It's finding someone to blame. The body of a young woman was found lifeless, and the police needed quick answers. The community demanded justice, the press pressed for an outcome, and any uncertainty meant failure for the authorities. Someone needed to pay for that crime, and Barnes was in the wrong place at the wrong time. The most absurd? There wasn't a single piece of real evidence against him. No fingerprints at the crime scene, no credible witnesses who had seen him that day. No DNA, just one detail. He lived in the region. And for the system, that was enough. What happens when justice doesn't want the truth, but rather someone to blame? Anyone can become a target. Fear, pressure, and the need for an answer make doubt turns into accusation. And when that happens, it doesn't matter if you're innocent. That's how Stephen Barnes was. Dragged into the biggest nightmare of his life. No evidence, no chance of defense, just the weight of a conviction about to crush him. And believe me, what happened after that was even more revolting. If this story outrages you, don't let it be silenced. Comment "The system failed" and make this injustice echo. Mistakes like this destroy lives every day, and justice rarely looks back. From the first moment, the investigation of the case was a succession of errors, mistakes, and hasty decisions. There was no concrete evidence. There was no reliable witness. But even so, Stephen Barnes was already marked guilty even before a fair trial. And the scariest thing? The police weren't interested in the truth, just in closing the case as quickly as possible. Witnesses who were supposed to bring clarity to the investigation were pressured to shape their testimony to fit the prosecution's narrative. Some claimed to have seen Barnes near the crime scene, but when confronted, their versions changed. Important details were contradictory, descriptions did not match, but instead of re-evaluating the facts, authorities they continued to ignore everything that did not confirm their theory. And then came the most serious error. No concrete evidence, no DNA, no fingerprints, no confession. What was left to support the accusation? A supposed scientific analysis. Prosecutors brought in experts to say tire tracks found near the crime scene were consistent with Barnes's car. But compatible doesn't mean identical. And worse, this same analysis was carried out with clothing fibers, stating that the fabric found at the scene could be similar to what Barnes was wearing. But was that enough evidence to sentence someone to life in prison? Of course. But for the prosecution, it was enough. They didn't need certainty, just an argument that sounded convincing. The jury did not have the technical knowledge to question. Barnes's defense did not have the strength to combat the prosecution's. Pressure. The result? An innocent man was buried alive inside a cell. If this happened to him, how many innocent people are being convicted right now? Comment, evidence or assumptions, because what they did to Stephen Barnes could be happening right now, before our eyes, and no one is watching. Stephen Barnes believed justice would work. In the end, there was no evidence against him. No credible witnesses, no forensic evidence, nothing that actually tied him to the crime. The truth was on his side. But what he didn't know was that in that court, the truth didn't matter. From the first moment, the environment was hostile. Community fear, media pressure, and the need to find someone to blame, they had turned that trial into a spectacle. What should be a fair process became a theater, where the prosecution needed no evidence, just a plot compelling enough to sway the jury. Prosecutors used strong words, exploited the pain of the victim's family, and painted Barnes as a monster, even without having anything concrete against him. Doubt was transformed into certainty, uncertainty in condemnation, all based on fear, pressure, and the false sense that justice was being done. Barnes's defense tried to argue. He stated the obvious. There was no DNA, there were no fingerprints, there was nothing. But each argument was dismissed, ignored, overshadowed by fiery speeches from the prosecution. The jury was not made up of experts. They didn't need proof, just a story that made sense. Then the decisive moment arrived, the verdict. Stephen Barnes stood his ground, still believing that logic would prevail. But when the words were spoken, his life was destroyed forever. Guilty. The weight of that word crushed everything. Guilty of a crime he didn't commit, guilty without proof, guilty because the system needed someone to blame. The sentence was given, life imprisonment. Stephen Barnes was taken away, handcuffed, without understanding how it had happened. The real criminal was still free, and Barnes was buried alive inside a cell. If a court can convict a man without evidence, how many innocent people are in prison right now? Justice fails in silence, but this story cannot be forgotten. Share now. The more people who know about this injustice, the less chance it will happen again. Being unfairly convicted is already a nightmare, but being thrown behind bars, knowing that the real criminal remains free, is something that destroys anyone's mind. Stephen Barnes entered prison as a young man, full of life, but with each passing day, something inside him died. From the first moment he realized that there was no room for innocence in there. It didn't matter if he hadn't committed any crime. In prison, everyone is guilty. There were no second chances, there was no understanding. The system failed, and now he was paying for something he didn't do. The environment was suffocating. The cells were small, damp, with no privacy. The smell of mold and rusty metal permeated the air. The sound of the closing gates echoed every night, reminding us that time didn't pass in there. It just dragged on. Meals were served on dirty aluminum trays, always the same, tasteless, lifeless. The early morning cold entered through the cracks in the cracked walls, and the silence of the night was frequently interrupted by distant screams, fights between inmates, and the echo of the footsteps of guards patrolling the corridors. Each day was the same as the other, and every day was a cruel reminder that he was never supposed to be there. But the worst part wasn't the cramped cell. The worst part was knowing that the real killer was still out there. As Barnes slept on a dirty mattress, surrounded by walls that suffocated him, the real culprit continued living freely, as if nothing had happened. He asked himself, how much longer would this person go unpunished? How many other victims would suffer? The years passed, and prison time doesn't just rob you of your freedom, it robs you of your identity. The first few years, Barnes still received visitors. His mother went to see him whenever she could. But over time, visits became rarer. Friends stopped showing up. Contact with the outside world became increasingly distant, until one day he realized he was completely alone. He lost everything: your youth, your family, your future. While the people outside went on with their lives, he remained frozen in time, trapped in a place he should never have been. But even so, he never gave up. He knew he was innocent, but who would believe him? Mistakes like this destroy lives every day, while the real culprit remains free. The truth cannot be ignored. Share this story so more people know what really happens when justice fails. For 25 years, Stephen Barnes survived inside a cold cell, forgotten by the world. The hope of one day proving his innocence wore itself out with every dawn until it almost disappears. Time kept moving forward, but for him, life had stopped the day he was sentenced. But then, something unexpected happened. Science has evolved. Tests that were previously inconclusive now become definitive. And with that, organizations emerged willing to fight against judicial errors. Among them, the Innocence Project, a group specializing in reviewing wrongful convictions. For the first time in decades, a new door opened for Barnes. But would justice allow this reassessment? Even with scientific advances, the system doesn't like to admit it made a mistake. Each new forensic examination challenged old sentences, revealing what many already suspected. Hundreds of people were convicted without concrete evidence. But would Barnes, after so long, have the chance to remake his story? His case was analyzed, and the big question was one: would it be possible to finally prove his innocence? The request for review was made, and this time, there was no longer any way to ignore the facts. The DNA test was performed, compared, tested, again. And then came the truth that Barnes had been waiting for all his life. He was never at the crime scene. The evidence that once held him back crumbled like sand between his fingers. No connection to the murder, no trace of DNA, nothing that would justify 25 years of suffering. The system had made an irreparable error, but what now? How do you recover a lost quarter of a century? Mistakes like this aren't just numbers. They destroy lives, families, and futures. Pretending it didn't happen doesn't change reality. This story needs to be heard. Share now, because admitting a mistake doesn't erase the damage it caused. The prison doors opened, and for the first time in 25 years, Stephen Barnes walked out without handcuffs, without an escort, without a destination already set by other people. But was he really free, or would prison still be with him forever? The world was no longer the same. When Barnes was arrested, cell phones were not common. The internet was still in its infancy. Technology was different, people had changed. What once felt familiar now felt like a completely new universe. But the biggest shock wasn't what was around, it was what was inside him. He emerged from prison a marked man, carrying a weight that no one else could see. The memories of lost time, the injustices suffered, the emptiness of 25 years that could never be recovered. His friends moved on. His family changed. The city he once knew no longer recognized him. Was he still the young man who entered prison? Or had that version of him died on the day of doom? Being freed after so long, it doesn't mean getting your life back. A cell can be in a concrete building, or it can exist in the mind. And that last one, he would carry forever. How much is an apology worth? How do you rebuild a future when everything you had has been ripped away? The system made a mistake and moved on. But what about Barnes? How do you move forward when the past is still an open wound? Injustices like this cannot be forgotten. Share this truth, because there are many other people who are still waiting for the day of their freedom, if it ever really arrives. Stephen Barnes lost 25 years of your life for a crime he never committed. Years locked in a cell, watching his youth slip away. While he tried to breathe inside the cell, the killer was outside, carrying on with his life as if nothing had happened. When he finally got out of prison, he received $1 million compensation. But does this really mean justice? How much is a life interrupted worth? How much do the hugs he didn't give, the moments he missed, the dreams that were destroyed cost? The government has placed a value on your freedom, as if money can erase suffering, as if millions can replace stolen decades. But when I looked in the mirror, Barnes didn't see a millionaire man. I saw a man who never had a choice. And the scariest thing, he wasn't the only one. Stephen Barnes was just one of thousands. Other innocent people remain. Behind bars right now, living the same nightmare, waiting for a chance to prove the system wrong. But does the system really learn from its mistakes? Or do you just move forward without looking back? Comment here, fairness or price? Because admitting a mistake is not the same as correcting it. Stephen Barnes could be anyone. It could be you, someone in your family, a close friend. He trusted in justice, believed that the truth would prevail, but he found out the hard way that when the system decides you are guilty, it doesn't matter if there is evidence or not. How many other people are living this nightmare right now? How many innocent people are rotting behind bars while the real culprit remains free? The worst mistake anyone can make is thinking that this can never happen to them. After everything you've seen here, is an apology enough? Should the system be more rigorous before convicting someone without evidence? The truth needs to be told, and every voice makes a difference. If you believe that injustices like this cannot be ignored, share this story now. And if you want to discover the cases that many try to hide, sign up and turn on notifications. But get ready. If this has already outraged you, the next case will shake your trust in justice once and for all. You can't miss what happened.